Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, February the 5th. We're continuing our look through the first 11 chapters in the Gospel of John. This week we get to chapter 8. Our lesson's entitled, I Am the Light. Jesus offers grace and forgiveness to all who repent and believe in Him. Our focal passage covers the first 18 verses in John chapter 8. The larger lesson is the whole chapter, which is 59 verses, and it's a good chapter. All 59 verses are important there, but we focus on the first part of it. A very familiar passage, but it's curious in that those first 11 verses are not found in some of the older manuscripts. So there's some controversy about whether they should be included or not. I looked at several different sources and commentaries about all of that. And I want to read to you H.A. Ironside, the old-time preacher, his take on that, because it's pretty representative, and I think he does a good job of kind of putting this in perspective and context. He says, we should recognize at the very beginning that in the minds of many people, many Bible critics, many Christian scholars, this entire passage is considered questionable because in some of the older manuscripts, you will not find these 11 verses. On the other hand, it's rather an interesting fact that in a number of these ancient manuscripts, while these verses are omitted, there's a blank space left on the page showing that evidently the scribe meant to indicate that in some other manuscripts, something came in between verse 52 of chapter 7 and verse 12 of chapter 8. In other manuscripts, the section's omitted altogether. Some, again, give us the passage but do not place it here in this spot. They put it at the end of John's Gospel as kind of a postscript. On the other hand, we have very good authority for regarding it as genuine, for it's found in many old Greek manuscripts, and it seems very evident that it's part of this Gospel. The reason that it's omitted in many instances, I take it, is because some of the early Christians apparently felt that a story like this, which seemed to suggest a lenient attitude toward immoral behavior, might be misunderstood, and particularly by a people just emerging from heathenism with all of its vile and impure practices. But one only needs to read the rest of the gospel to see how false such an assumption would be. As we read on in this chapter, we find many definite references to this very incident. There are passages that could not be clearly and properly understood if this story were missing. Personally, I think the translators did exactly right in including it as part of the sacred text without any marks of any kind to differentiate it from the rest of the gospel. The Revised Standard Version sets it off by parentheses, and many do not consider it genuine. However, anyone who knows the grace of God as revealed in Christ must recognize it as genuine, for it is so like Jesus to do what he's represented as doing here. And after all, the sins of this poor woman is no worse than the sins of every one of us. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way, Isaiah 53:6 tells us. The first clause here speaks of the sin of the race. The entire human race has gone astray. The second clause indicates our individual iniquities. We have turned everyone to his own way. And there are people who have been kept from fleshly indulgences such as this, and yet are guilty in God's sight of sins of the mind and of the heart that are just as vile, unholy, and unclean in his sight as sins of the flesh. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. So, in this story that we're going to see, we contemplate the grace of God to this one sinner, and that same grace is extended to all sinners who will avail themselves of it. So, we press on and we take those first 11 verses as belonging right here. As we pick up from last week, at the end of chapter 7 in verse 53, it says, everyone went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives here. And Jesus often went to the Mount of Olives. The Garden of Gethsemane was there. He often went there to pray. And so perhaps that's the reason that he went there. But verse 2 tells us very early in the morning, he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Early in the morning literally means at dawn. All the people came. This is right following the Feast of Tabernacles, and there were many people in Jerusalem, and so they came to hear Jesus teach. And so he sat, it says, and taught them. Teachers in ancient Israel, that was the way they did. They sat when they taught. And so Jesus assumed this position of an authoritative teacher. Verses 3 through 6, then, let's look at those. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? This they said to him, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So, in verse 3, as Jesus is sitting there teaching, this group of scribes and Pharisees very abruptly interrupted him and brought this woman. And the scribes were those who copied and taught the scriptures. The Pharisees, of course, were familiar with. They're one of those Jewish sects there that grew between in the period between the Old and the New Testament. They were very zealous for the law, and probably somewhere 5 to 10% of the Jews belonged to the Pharisees, and so their purpose was to kind of construct a fence so that people would not fall into the trap of disobeying the law. That's one of the reasons that all of those 613 different prescribed practices grew up here. So they brought this woman who was caught in the act of adultery, and they set her in the midst here. They made the implication, they kind of made her stand in the center, probably between Jesus and the group of people that he was teaching here. So they showed very little respect here for the woman, Jesus, or the people he was teaching. In verse 4, they said, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. And then they said, Moses in the law commanded that one's caught in adultery should be stoned here. Both Leviticus and Deuteronomy have that scripture and that command about being stoned. It was stoning was specified in specific instances, not in every instance there. But as you read in Leviticus 20, chapter 10, the man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death. So the law said that both the adulterer and the adulteress, both the man and the woman, should be put to death. These scribes and Pharisees bring just the woman. We're never told what happened to the man, why he's not brought here, but probably it has to do with the fact that they're not really interested in being the keepers of the law here. That's not their main objective. Their main objective is to put Jesus in a position where they can trap him into saying something, where they can make an accusation against him. So they quote the law. Moses commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? And that the question to Jesus, what do you say, is pretty intense. The you in the Greek is emphatic. But you, what do you say here? And verse 6, John tells us exactly what their motivation was. This, they said, testing him. They wanted Jesus to contradict the law of Moses. If they could succeed in doing that, then they could have something to accuse him of. They could turn the people against him. And when it says they were testing him, the dilemma that they posed was this. According to the law, she should be put to death, as we've just read here. If then Jesus refuses to confirm the death penalty, they could say, well, you're contradicting the law of God. And so he could be condemned for that. But if, on the other hand, he confirmed that verdict of the Pharisees and said, yes, she should be stoned to death, he would lose his reputation for compassion, and he also runs the risk of being reported to the Romans here, because he would be advocating for the Jews to carry out a capital punishment, which they didn't have the authority to do here. So they've carefully constructed this trap to lead Jesus into it. But Jesus didn't fall into their trap. Verse 6 tells us that he acted like he didn't hear them even. And he stooped down and started to write on the ground with his finger. This is the only instance we have of Jesus writing. It's the only recorded instance we have of him writing something. Don't you wish you knew what it was that he was writing there on the ground? But we don't know. It's impossible to say. Some suggest that he was writing the Ten Commandments. And if he was doing that, was he simply reminding them that the Ten Commandments had been originally written with the finger of God, as it says in Exodus 31:18, and that he is God? Or was he perhaps writing and reminding them of what's written in Jeremiah 17? H.A. Ironside, in his commentary, suggests that scenario. He says, we read that Jesus stooped down and wrote upon the ground as though he didn't hear them. Why did he do that? These men were familiar with the Scriptures, but it's sadly possible to be familiar with the Scriptures and have a heart as hard as a millstone, ever ready to heap condemnation upon other people, forgetting that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Because they knew the Bible, they must have known of the passage in the book of Jeremiah which says, O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be ashamed. Those who depart from me shall be written in the earth. That could be translated written on the ground, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters. And so he draws this word picture. See them gathered about, and Jesus stoops down and writes on the ground, and they turn one to another and say, what's he doing? Writing on the ground. Wait a minute. Writing on the ground. Isn't there something in our scriptures about writing on the ground? And so perhaps that's what Jesus wrote. We don't know. There's no way to know. But as we're going to see, what he wrote and what he said had a powerful, powerful effect. Verses 7 through 11. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. And when Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? And she said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Well, the questioners, these scribes and Pharisees, they kept pressing Jesus for an answer. And so he responded by just putting the dilemma back in their lap here. Jewish law also required that the accusers cast the first stone. Deuteronomy 17, 6 and 7. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all people. So you shall put away the evil from among you. And so that's what Jesus said. Let he who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone. And when he had said this to him, again, he stooped back down and he continued to write on the ground. Those who heard it, those that he were pressing him for the answer, and those he said to cast the first stone. John says being convicted by their conscience. Now, again, some of the ancient manuscripts omit that phrase there. But can there be any doubt that that's exactly what happened here? They were convicted by their conscience, and one by one they began to go away. They were not willing to cast the first stone. And it's interesting, John records for us, beginning with the oldest, even to the last. The older ones either had more sins for which they were answerable, or else had more sense than to make an impossible profession of righteousness, one writer says. I kind of suspect as I get older and as I have built this great catalog of sins and failures, and as one accumulates after the other, I find it much easier to empathize with others' failures. 50 years ago, I suspect I could be pretty judgmental there and quick to condemn others. But as my failures have mounted it's easier as I'm older to be less condemnatory and to empathize with those who fail. Well, maybe that's what's happening here. But whatever reason, the oldest to the youngest, they all went away, and Jesus was left alone with the woman, and she's still standing in the midst. And so Jesus raised up, and he looked around. He saw no one but the woman, and so he said to her, "Woman, where are those accusers?" Now, his address to the woman was respectful. When he says to her, "Woman, where are your accusers?" it reminds us of the way Jesus responded to his mother there at that wedding in Cana. He used that same form of address. It was a respectful form of address. And in a wonderful demonstration of grace, Jesus pointed out to the woman that her accusers had vanished. They were nowhere to be found. There was not a single person who was willing and dared to condemn her. And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Verse 11, that's one of the most powerful and beautiful statements in the Bible. Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you." It reminds us of what Jesus said back in the 3rd chapter of John that we studied a few weeks ago. In verse 17, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. Jesus' words here in verse 11 have inspired more than one poet and songwriter down through the years. And when I read those words, I was reminded of a song that was popular when I was young. And I was interested in it. I went looking to find the origin of it, and it's kind of obscure, but apparently it goes back to the late 1800s, a song, perhaps two songs that were written. But in the 60s and 70s, then there were various artists that adapted that song or those songs into this song. The refrain, there's several verses to the song, and it's kind of the verses are kind of awkward, but the refrain is a beautiful statement. It says, "Neither do I condemn you." Precious words divine, from the lips of mercy, like the sweetest chimes. Wonderful words of Jesus, sing them o'er and o'er. Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. In the 1st chapter of John, the very first lesson that we studied, we learned that grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. John 1:14 says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ," verse 17 says. Here in verse 11, we see an example of that. "Neither do I condemn you." We have an example, a wonderful example of grace. The words "go and sin no more" are words of truth. The Lord didn't say go and sin as little as possible. Jesus Christ is God, and his standard is absolute perfection. He cannot approve of sin in any degree. And so he sets before her the perfect standard of God himself. Now you might be protesting, but Jesus is telling her to do something she can't possibly do. All of us are sinners, and she nor anyone else can live up to that standard. And you're exactly right if that's what you're thinking. And that's why his words are so significant. The nature of his kingdom and the revealing of his purpose had to be understood by the world And the truth that's expressed here was so important for Jesus to get across to the world. That standard of absolute perfection is why it was necessary for Jesus to come into the world in human form, to die on the cross, by taking the form of a man and dying on the cross as the atoning sacrifice for every sinner. Jesus can present us to God as being without sin. Jesus took our sin on himself, and that's the only way that we can meet God's standard of perfection. Verses 12 through 18. Then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And the Pharisees therefore said to him, You bear witness of yourself. Your witness is not true or not valid as testimony. And Jesus answered and said to them, Even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true, for I know where I came from and where I'm going. But you do not know where I come from and where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. And yet, if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I'm not alone, but I am with the Father who sent me. It is also written in your law that the testimony of two men is true. I am one who bears witness of myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness of me. Jesus spoke to him again, saying, I am the light of the world. This is the second of the great I am statements. There's 7 of them in John. And so, what did Jesus mean when he said, I'm the light of the world? Our lesson writer says, in one sense, Jesus as the light of the world exposes sin, like the hypocrisy of the religious leaders and the immorality of the adulterous woman that we've just seen. More positively, he illuminates the path of all who follow him. Psalm 119, 105 says, Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Since Jesus is the light of the world, we as believers need never walk in darkness. The Believer's Bible Commentary offers this. Naturally speaking, the world is in the darkness of sin, ignorance, and aimlessness. The light of the world is Jesus. Apart from him, there's no deliverance from the blackness of sin. Apart from him, there is no guidance along the way of life, no knowledge as to the real meaning of life and the issues of eternity. Jesus promised that anyone following him would not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. You wonder what prompted Jesus at this point to say, I'm the light of the world. We read in verse 2 there that he came early in the morning at dawn. So perhaps the rising of the sun was the impetus for Jesus to make this statement right at this time. There is for our galaxy only one sun, S-U-N, and it's the center and the source of life. So there's but one God who's the center of all and the source of all life. John 1, 4, God is light. 1 John 1, 4, and 5, in him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And wherever the light shines, it reveals humanity's wickedness. Ephesians 5, starting at verse 8, you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. And then verse 11, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. There's another possibility here. The Feast of Tabernacles has just concluded. And one of the things that happened there at the Feast of Tabernacles was the menorah, that huge candelabra, was lit in the temple to remind the people of the pillar of fire that had guided Israel in its wilderness journey. So perhaps this played a role here at this particular time in him saying, I am the light of the world. The Pharisees, in verse 13, as usual, they challenged Jesus' claim when he said, I'm the light of the world. You bear witness of yourself, they said. And so your witness is not valid. A testimony concerning oneself would be unacceptable because of the bias there. Well, Jesus answers them, and he says basically that his case is different. Even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true, and the reason, he says, is that I know where I come from and where I am going. So he possessed knowledge that they didn't have. He knew where he came from, where he was going. Later on in John 13, verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand and that he had come from God and was going to God. So he says to these Pharisees, the testimony about his testimony about himself was more accurate than that of his opponents, because they had no idea either of his origin or his destiny. Back in chapter 5, we saw that, or chapter 7, I'm sorry, we saw that Jesus, when he taught in the temple, says, you both know me and you know where I'm from, physically, here. And I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know. But I know him, for I am from him, and he sent me. And so Jesus makes that declaration to them. And then he says, you judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. So he argued that the Pharisees weren't qualified to render a verdict on the validity of his witness because they were using the wrong criterion, that of human standards. And he said, I judge no one. During his earthly ministry, Jesus was primarily Savior rather than judge. John 3:17 says that for God sent not the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. In John 12:46, I have come as a light into the world, that whoever believes in me should not abide in darkness. And if anyone hears my words and does not believe, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. He who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. For I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me gave me a command what I should say and what I should speak. It's true that in the future he will judge the world. Back in chapter 5, he makes that statement that God has given to him the authority for judgment. But that's later to come. But he says, if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I'm not alone, but I'm with the Father who sent me. It's also written in your law that the testimony of two men is true. Now this is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees. Deuteronomy 19:15 says, one witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. And so Jesus calls that to their mind here. He says in verse 16, I'm not alone, but I'm with the Father who sent me. And he says, I'm one who bears witness of myself. I'm one of those witnesses. And the Father who sent me also bears witness of me. So he says that he would qualify as one of the witnesses and his Father who sent him as the other. So in these verses, in this conversation with these Pharisees, Jesus gives three reasons why his witness is true. He knew his origin and his destiny, while the Jews were ignorant even of basic spiritual truths, making their judgment limited and superficial. We saw that in verses 14 and 15. The intimate union of the Son with the Father guaranteed the truth of the Son's witness. Verse 16. And the Father and Son witnessed harmoniously together regarding the identity of the Son. Verses 17 and 18. As I said, that's verse 18 is where our lesson ends. But the rest of the chapter has some wonderful passages and wonderful truths. Down in verse 31 and 32, Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, "If you abide in my words, you're my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." There, that beautiful statement there. On down at the end of the chapter, he reminds them of Abraham. And he says that Abraham had a preview of his ministry and had rejoiced in it here. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. And the Jews were incredulous. They said to him, "You're not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" And Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." That's a claim to deity. I am implies continuous existence, including existence when Abraham appeared. And so Jesus asserted that at the time of Abraham's birth, he existed. And I am was recognized by the Jews as a title of deity because when God spoke to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 3, Moses said to God, "Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "This you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you." So, Jesus said, "Most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." He also said, "I am the light of the world." So, all through chapter 8 here, we see those claims to deity. The last verse says they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. A lot in this chapter. Come back next week, we'll pick up with chapter 9. Thank you.